Welcome to the Numerical Tarot, a new tarot paradigm, an alternative to tradition, an axial system of archetypal crystallography, a trans-culturally anthropomorphized life-biased binary influence calculator, a wisdom system and archetype enhancer with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. If you have been watching this series of videos in sequence, and I hope you are, you might be thinking by now that the minor suits seem to be more major than the major icons. And in some ways they are. But don't worry, the major icons are still major. In fact, in addition to previous descriptions of the majors as the parents to the children of the minors, the majors can also be considered like gods or influencers to the minors, which would be mortals or the influenced. So let's examine in further detail just how the Numerical Tarot sees this part of the deck. In the eyes of many, the Numerical Tarot is so different that some have even suggested that I not call my deck a tarot deck at all. One of the reasons that people give for such a suggestion is the fact that I don't see the major icons of the deck as an unbroken string of 22, and the fact that I don't include any 10s in my minor suits. What I do instead is divide the deck into 4 smaller, but intimately related decks. In this schema, one deck consists of 2 rows of 9 cards. The other deck consists of 4 cards. The 2 rows of 9 major cards are then split to become the 4 rows of minor cards, while the 4 suits then are crossed as a grid to become the 16 cards of the court. Like so. In splitting the majors into minors, we establish that parent to child, or god to mortal relationship just mentioned, between any card with the same number, something I personally see as an improvement over the current design of most decks. But, because of these changes, many believe that I depart from tradition too far and should not be included in discussions about tarot, as most people understand it. And when I think about it, I almost agree with them, until I look at how other people have manipulated and rearranged their tarot decks. Some people attach the 12 signs of the zodiac to the court cards of the deck. This of course leaves 4 of those 16 cards left over to be thought of as something else. Some people attribute the minor arcana to the 36 decanates of the zodiac. This of course leaves 4 of those 40 cards left over to be thought of as something else. The people of tarot generally accept these types of discrepancies. So it shouldn't be such a big deal when we observe how the Numerical Tarot associates the 9 numbers of numerology to the major arcana, resulting in 2 parallel rows of 9 opposites. This of course leaves 4 cards left over to be thought of as something else, which, if well considered, is not really much more drastic a manipulation than any other. And so, one would think it to not be such an impossible task to consider the possible advantages of this manipulation, being that it is like so many other manipulations of tarot out there today. This video asks us to consider those advantages. In the meantime, I will continue to call my deck a tarot deck, only because of the remarkable similarities that I see between my parallel 9s approach and the oldest designs of tarot and playing cards that we know. In manipulating the major arcana of tarot into 2 separate decks, I see many things that are not so apparent when the majors are viewed as an unbroken string of 22 icons, or even 3 rows of 7 with 1 left over, another very popular manipulation of design accepted by many. By arranging the first 18 cards of the majors into 2 parallel rows of 9 opposites, a level of contrast appears that does not come through any other way. Of course, as we have learned thus far, the major icons of the Numerical Tarot are not really based on traditional ideas at all. The major icons of the Numerical Tarot are constructed from a common sense, intuitive process, and natural evolution of simple abstract conceptual ideas. The numbers used, and the nature of the sequencing, is based on the expression of an abstract conceptual model of ideas. As intangible, abstract, conceptual ideas are labeled, defined and illustrated, considerations are made for the most extreme and moderate expressions of each core idea. Thus, the major icons of the Numerical Tarot are devoted to a strictly balanced perspective of extremes and in-betweens. The balance of so-called good and bad cards within the Numerical Tarot is most evident within the 18 cards of the major icons. In this arrangement, opposition of form is important. By presenting a form that is devoted to opposites, the major icons of the numerical tarot resemble the skeleton of an animal, symmetrical in every way. Like so. And while the sides of an animal's skeleton are not intrinsically good or bad in nature, they are diametrically opposite, and therein lies the analogy of form to the major icons of the numerical tarot. The numerical tarot is constructed with opposites in mind, which means the major icons have a spine, along which we will find matched pairs of opposites, just like the spine of an animal's skeleton. These opposites are eventually subdivided further, by considering their reversed meanings, and thereby include, in between, ideas that then create a full spectrum of possibilities for any one number along the line, or spine of the deck. Additionally, the minor suits of this deck are seen as a complete duplication of this major icon arrangement, subdivided even further to include quantitative and qualitative variations of each extreme and in-between idea. It is in this way that we establish a parent-to-child, or god-to-mortal relationship between cards of the major icons and cards of the minor suits. By having such an intimate relationship, the major icons no longer seem like a separate idea arbitrarily attached to a regular playing card deck just for the purposes of creating a game with superior cards. With this parent-to-child or god-to-mortal relationship, the majors and the minors are as one. They are two expressions of the same thing, one more general, the other more detailed. But the real interesting part of all this begins when we superimpose this symmetrical skeleton idea upon the major arcana of a traditional deck. When I superimpose this skeleton over the major arcana of a traditional deck, I see many similarities in form. In fact, even without such a template in mind, there are many places where cards in a traditional deck line up as opposites when arranged like 18 bones of a skeleton along a spine. Unfortunately, there are also a few places where it appears that someone has misplaced a bone or two. Places where a right arm has been placed on the left side. Places where a person with a bias to mitigate the bad from each card has watered down the intensity of an icon or symbol to such a degree as to completely lose the contrast, balance and symmetry that a perfect skeleton would dictate. And places where a leg bone and an arm bone have been switched. Of course, nothing about a traditional deck looks out of place at all to those who are strict adherents to the 22/40/16 school of tarot design, where we are only allowed to view the majors as an unbroken string of 22, the minors as 4 suits of 10, and the court as 4 suits of 4. For those people, objections to this spinal path of analysis are no doubt already forming. But what if? What if we could imagine the majors as 2 rows of 9? What if we could imagine the first row as good and life-affirming and the second row as bad and life-detracting? What if we imagine cards 10 through 18 in their worst possible light, as nothing but dark, evil, and bad? And I mean unmitigated bad. Like a Halloween nightmare. What if we could imagine cards 10 through 18 as a progression of an entity toward a totally undignified death, 9 cards of unspeakable horror, fright and misery? This may not have been the intent of tarot's original creator, but let's just see what happens if we look at things that way. Let's start with the pair of 6 and 15. In superimposing a parallel 9 approach over a more traditional deck, there is one pair of cards that already line up pretty good as opposites across a spine. They are known as the Lovers and the Devil. In a deck like the Rider-Waite-Smith, the visual similarities between the Lovers and the Devil are amazing. Both include a winged creature that seems to mediate or influence 2 humans. Even in other decks, the Lovers often features an angel that stands between the lovers, allowing it to oppose an often winged devil. Thus, if we are being asked to imagine the majors as opposites, then perhaps we should be focusing our attention more on the angel in the Lovers card than on the actual lovers, allowing us to see it as a diametrical opposite to the devil. The angel represents a good influence and good choices. The devil represents a bad influence and bad choices. That makes sense. Let's look next at the 3 and 12 pair. If we are also imagining other cards to be dark, evil and bad, then perhaps the pain and suffering of the Hanged Man is real. By that I mean, maybe he symbolizes unmitigated pain and suffering, rather than mitigated pain and suffering. Maybe he isn't just being hung upside down in some kind of willing self-sacrifice to a spiritual pursuit. Maybe he is being hung upside down because he is a hated and despised evil character who is being tortured to death by people who hate him. Maybe he is hanging because he is a beast, being drawn and quartered like a pig. As a beast, He would definitely fit as the diametrical opposite to the Empress, who is without a doubt a beauty. She is loved. She lives in comfort. She caresses the body and spirit. She fills us with joy. Everyone likes her. The combination of beauty and the beast is a classic story told over and over in many ways. It is archetypal, so it makes sense to have it appear in a progression of opposites like this. Yes? Let's move on now to the 4 and 13 pair. Lots of people fear the death card. Some change the name to change. Change happens when something old is destroyed and replaced by something new. So what about the destructive, debilitating influence of the death card? A dark and evil approach does not force us to view this card as literal death, but it does force us to view it as destructive and debilitating in the harshest and most unmitigated way. In this new light, death still means change, but change for the worst. Destructive, debilitating change that leaves us weak and vulnerable to the influences that will eventually bring about our demise. Death is the villain who is torturing our beast. As an opposite, the emperor is a hero who protects our empress or beauty. Death is a villain who destroys and weakens. The emperor is a hero who builds and strengthens. Almost all stories have a hero and villain. It is very archetypal. So, again, it makes sense to have them appear in a progression of opposites like this. Yes? Moving on. Let's imagine the Wheel of Fortune card in its worst possible light. In its worst possible light, it no longer represents the life lessons of fate's ups and downs. In its worst possible light, it represents unmitigated bad luck. A turn for the worst, bad fate, the beginning of the end, the influence of a jinx, who puts into motion a tragedy of errors that will lead to our eventual demise. There is nothing we can do about this, it is in the hands of fate. We let the wheel spin and now we have to take what comes. As an opposite, the magician is like a genie, granting us 3 wishes. The magician makes things happen for us through force of will, not fate. He sets into motion a series of events that lead to our eventual enlightenment or ascendance to the heavens. The idea of free will versus fate is a philosophical conundrum we humans wrestle with often. One day we feel on top of the world. The next day we feel the world on top of us. Good luck. Bad luck. Another archetypal pairing that makes sense to have at the beginning of each of our 2 number lines. In a world where the people of tarot choose to mitigate the bad out of as many scary evil-looking cards as possible, the Tower card persists, and becomes one of a scant few such cards that become a catch-all repository for every bad thing a person can think of. So, if we imagine the Tower card in its worst possible light, then maybe we can see the violence of the destructive lightning bolt as an expression of the violence of a sadist. Some say the Tower represents sin and sinners being struck down. In the Numerical tarot, the sadist is the purveyor of the suffering that sinners deserve. As an opposite, the Chariot symbolizes spiritual transport to the heavens, perhaps Elijah being called up, like a saint, rather than a sadist, throwing down lightning bolts to sinners. In this way, both cards represent spirituality, or spirituality and the lack of spirituality. We thank the saint for sanctuary. We curse the sadist for suffering. Most stories involve some measure of suffering. Suffering plagues humanity, as we all seek some kind of sanctuary. At the end of our number lines we see 2 endings, that is, if we don't mitigate the bad out of every dark card in the deck. As a symbol of the final darkness of death, the moon is perfect. If thought of in its worst possible light, the disk of light the full moon cuts out of the empty blackness of a night sky can be seen as a portal to the great beyond. In a slightly anthropomorphized way, that portal could be seen as a ghoul that devours all souls into the empty blackness around it. The darkness of night is then seen as a great abyss of nothingness from which there is no return. As an opposite, the hermit, with all his knowledge and wisdom, is like a god that elevates all souls into heaven. He carries a light. His light is a beacon atop the ultimate highest ending goal of a mountain that touches the heavens. Go into the light. Become part of his everythingness. Most stories have an ending. Some endings are happy, blessed by God. Some endings are not so happy, damned by a ghoul. Sometimes there is a celebration at the end. Sometimes everyone dies in the end. It's life and death. Another archetypal pairing that makes sense to have at the ending of each of our 2 number lines. Right? If any of this sounds interesting, are convincing of the power of a spinal arrangement, Then let's consider some of the bones of tradition that seem to not fit so well, and try to imagine what should replace them. At the second stage of our number line, the nature of the high priestess bears much ambiguity. Does she represent mystery and the concealment of mysteries, or inspiration in the revealing and dispelling of mysteries? Does she represent clear vision or obscured vision? Given the dark and mysterious way in which she is most often drawn, and the veiling of her form, I'm inclined to fall on the side of mystery and obscured vision. So, if considered in her worst possible light, mystery and obfuscation would not fit with a sequence of cards devoted to a progression toward light, God and heaven. Which means, the high priestess is a misplaced bone on our skeleton of symmetry. If imagined in its worst possible light, the high priestess is a haunt that blocks out light, and hovers over us like a pall, or a rain cloud that follows us wherever we go. If we move the high priestess over to the negative side of our skeleton of symmetry, we eliminate the card of justice, and we are left with a gap in the positive sequence of cards. To fill this gap, we must invent a diametrically opposite looking bone for our skeleton that will represent everything the high priestess is not. We need a character of clear, unambiguous vision who inspires, reveals, and motivates. Like a muse. For those who wish to preserve the high priestess icon, we can look to those who view all her veils and darkness as a cloak that hides the light of life within, lest we be blinded by its radiance. In this sense, her veils are an obstacle that must be penetrated to advance to the stages of enlightenment that follow. In this sense, it could be argued that the high priestess is indeed properly placed after all. But, as so many choose to illustrate the occultation of that light with obfuscation, veils and darkness, she is, in practical terms, out of place. So in that sense, I see an unambiguously inspirational muse as a less equivocal icon to put in her place, with an obfuscating haunt as a logical opposite for our dark side. Next, as we approach the middle of our number line, let's consider the character of Professor Dumbledore, the wizard, from the Harry Potter series. Dumbledore is the master of the School of Magic. In that school he is the law, responsible for setting the rules and doling out punishment as needed. Not too different from the Hierophant of traditional tarot. The Hierophant is indeed not just about religion, he is about religious law, and the governing and administration of people within his domain, our church. The key concept in each case being control. The Hierophant is just like Dumbledore the wizard. Residing at the midpoint of our skeleton, they both represent the alchemistic mixing of sides, and the control over resultant potions of influence. But, if we consider the Hierophant as a wizard, governing the mixture of opposing sides at a midpoint of confluence, then we have redundancy within the icon of temperance. In their best possible light, the governance of the Hierophant, or our wizard, represent a temperate core, or a midpoint of confluence that is under control. Temperance, being somewhat uniquely positive-looking within a row of somewhat negative-looking cards, could be viewed as being like the calm, temperate eye of a hurricane amid swirling negativity to either side. But, in pursuing a continuity of positive and negative sides, we would have to say that the card of temperance is a misplaced, redundant bone on our skeleton of symmetry. Thus, if we eliminate the card of temperance, by combining it with our wizard, we leave another gap, this time in our negative sequence. So now we need to invent another diametrically opposite-looking bone that will represent everything our wizard is not. We need a character who stirs up trouble and mixes potions that cause turbulence between sides. Like an evil Oz, like witch. Good enough. What's next? Finally, in some decks the 8th card is Justice and card 11 is called Strength. In other decks, Justice is moved to card 11 and card 8 is the card of Strength. It seems that the occult scholars of the past could not agree whether the bone they held in their hands was an arm bone or a leg bone. The arrangement of 11 as Strength and Justice as an 8 may have come first, and there are good reasons for Justice to be an 8, but I think the concept of Strength fits just a bit better when considered as an opposite to a darkened, worst possible star card. If we imagine the star card in its worst possible light, the emptying containers of water come to represent the purging of energies from a life that is just one card away from death. If the star represents distant fading energy that is one card away from death, then Strength would be an appropriate opposite to have on a skeleton of symmetry. Although perhaps energy would be a more accurate title. As a symbol of energy that lies just one card away from God and heaven, the woman in the card of Strength represents a lumina, enlightening us and escorting us into the heavenly arms of a God. As an opposite, the woman in the star is like a wraith, coming to us to announce our impending doom, and pouring out our life forces in front of us. The lumina fills us with energy and lifts our spirits up. The wraith gives us that emptied, sinking feeling in our chest, and depresses our spirits down. Those are the ways that I would modify traditional tarot to express a more balanced and symmetrical design with high contrast between opposites. Can this be done and still be called tarot? Are we stuck with only one form of tarot to be allowed? This study presents an alternative, a new tarot paradigm. I hope that someday we will see decks of both kind. Tarot should evolve. It evolved into what the occultists made it. It has evolved into what the New Age has made it. It can evolve again into what this alternative makes it. Don't let tradition limit our options. Sorry to end on such a depressing note, but that's how I see the major icons of tarot, balanced and symmetrical, with high contrast and careful consistency. I would encourage you to study the common sense symmetry of this deck in detail, and then superimpose it upon your favorite traditional deck. See if you don't see the remarkable similarities. See if you don't subsequently view the differences as violations of common sense symmetry. If you are completely devoted to a traditional 22-40-16 arrangement of tarot or an approach that mitigates the bad out of every card, you may never see anything but 22-40-16. However, if you are open to new ideas, you might see something significant and interesting and want to look deeper. I hope you do look deeper. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Hope it made sense. Links to eBooks, decks and merchandise below. And if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.